Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel. Due to some requests, I'm going to make a short video quickly talking about all the weapons that you see lying around behind me, where I got them, what they mean, and what I do with them. So as you might already know, I have a whole stockpile of generic weapons that I used back when I used to run a large Chinese martial arts school. I haven't been running a proper school for years, and those weapons are just collecting dust on the corner of my lounge and also more in the storeroom. However, unlike those generic weapons, all the ones that you see behind me are actually all unique and mean something to me personally. And today I'm going to basically go through them and explain to you what kind of weapons they are, if they have any history with me personally, and what do I actually do with them. To start off, let's first look at the two Chinese-fashioned Dao routes. That means single broadsword. It's one of the most iconic Chinese traditional short weapon. Let's look at those two that's directly behind me. So these are both made specifically for my father. And if you actually pull them out, his name is actually inscribed on the blade by the swordsmiths that made them, and they're made in pretty good quality. This one is very well weighted, very nicely when you keep in your hand and do your practice with. And you can see it's slightly floppy, but contrary to popular belief, not all real traditional Chinese Dao are as hardened and thick as the Japanese blade, right? The popularity of the Japanese blade tend to make people think all realistic cutting weapons have to be stiff-spined, but that's not actually true for Chinese weapons. So even though this look a little bit floppy, it is actually a real proper sword that can be sharpened. This one is not sharpened at all, but it can be sharpened and used for real Dao purpose, although this one is just used for practice. It is hand forged and not cut from a piece of metal like the contemporary fake weapons. And on the inscription, it says that this is made by Longquan, which is one of the most famous sword places in China, and by the swordsmith called Shen Guanglong, and it's made in 1984, specifically for my father. And it's probably one of his favorite Dao. And the one that is underneath is also made by the same blacksmith, Shen Guanglong, from Longquan, and also has my father's name inscribed on it, and it's also made in 1984, 1st of May. The difference is this is a slightly heavier variant of Dao, and it's a bit more hefty and unwieldy, and as you can see, it's less flimsy, it's actually more rigid. So you can basically think of this as a heavier version of that previous one. So if this were to be sharpened, this one is not, it would be better probably at cutting due to the weight and the slightly more stiff spine. But there's still certain flexibility, as you can see, which is actually quite important for some of the Chinese Dao technique. That's why we don't actually use a completely stiff spine blade like the Japanese katana. So an average Dao is most likely lighter than this, so this one is definitely made specifically to be on the heavy end, and as a result will probably give you a much better cutting power due to the sheer weight. When I was younger, I used to practice with this because it's the heaviest Dao out of all my father's collections, but I haven't really practiced them in quite some time. So both of these are passed down to me by my father because he no longer needs them, he has no interest in Chinese martial art anymore. So naturally he doesn't need to keep this blade anymore, even though they are made specifically for him. So as a result, lucky for me, I have these two pretty cool Chinese Dao with personal meaning to myself and my father. In a similar fashion, here is a Chinese straight sword, or what we call a Tien, which is also forged by the same Longquan blacksmith called Shen Guanglong. I assume he's quite famous at the time, and probably still famous today if his brand is still around. This one is also made specifically for my father, with his name inscribed on the blade. You probably can't see this at this distance, but this jian is longer than the average Chinese jian, and as a result, it is both longer, have better reach, and heavier. So this is specially made back when my father was doing the Shaobei Quan's version of 13 sword. Now why is that different? Because that particular straight sword style don't emphasize on the wrist motion and almost rapier-like attacks that are more common to Chinese Jian styles. Rather, it uses a more larger circular movement with more hacking. I mean, it does use its point to thrust and poke. That is more hacking motion, which is why it actually requires a longer and heavier jian compared to the regular Chinese jian that people are most accustomed to. And as you can see, this sword, although it's narrow and thin, is not actually very bendy. It's pretty stiff spined. And if I were to put on the ground, the blade doesn't bend at all, even if I apply force to it. So it's a pretty strong spine. It's very good for thrusting purpose. Well, that doesn't mean that it's completely stiff, right? It still has flexibility. It's just that it is stiffer than regular jian that you find outside, especially the fake ones. Those ones that bend too much, it's very hard to actually penetrate the target. Those ones, if I were to sharpen it, it will actually go through someone. So here is a good example of a regular sized Chinese jian, or like a small sword equivalent of the West. It's very short, narrow, and very light. So this is the type of ideal jian that we will use for styles that focus more on the wrist motion and small cuts and pokes that focus on angle over large round attacks. This one is also made by Shen Guanglong of Longquan, and although you probably can't see it, it's actually made with a pretty decent spine that has a kind of a groove-like thing that goes on the blade. Instead of having a blade just in a diamond shape, the surface, or if this is the spine and this is the edge, the surface of the sword actually bends like this. And to do that, it actually requires extra work, right? It's harder to make a spine like this than a regular diamond-shaped spine, which can just simply cut into that shape. I'm not sure if you can see it from the front, but yeah, there's like a slight groove to this blade. Now, a common misconception is that the groove is so that when you stab someone, blood can flow through the groove so that you can actually pull the sword out. That's actually not true at all. The reason to have such design is actually to take weight off the sword, right? If a sword just have a hard diamond-edged blade, basically there's more metal on this piece of sword, whereas if you make it curve like that, it actually takes up less metal and therefore it's lighter. You might think that it doesn't really matter, it's so little difference, but when you actually spread it out through the entire sword, it actually makes a huge difference when it comes to the weight and how wieldy the sword is. Also, and it basically reduces the weight without sacrificing the stiffness of the spine. So even though this one is more flexible than the other one, but it will still penetrate someone. Not like you can't stick through somebody, but similar to the Western rapier-like kind of sword, it will still be able to penetrate the front of your chest or your stomach and causes internal bleeding. So this one I use generally for back when I used to do mantis sword. There's a mantis sword form called Jian, which requires a lot of small wrist movement. It's very hard to do that with a heavy sword, which is why this is my go-to jian when I used to practice Jian fa. So all the above are weapons made specifically for my father from Longquan by a blacksmith brand called Shen Guanglong, and they were later on passed down to me. Next, I'm going to look at my own personal weapon that I collected rather than getting from my father. So first, let's get to my bread and butter, which is this katana here. When I say bread and butter, it means that this is the katana that I use the most, whether it was when I used to train katana or when I have something I actually need to have a weapon. This is my go-to one. It is same length as a regular katana, but it's actually made heavier. And as you can see, it's a very good quality blade, and unlike the Chinese sword, completely stiff. The edge doesn't waver at all because katana is made for heavy duty cutting. And if you see the spine of the katana, it's actually quite thick. It's thicker than your usual katana, and as a result, it actually makes this pretty hefty. It's not a very wieldy kind of weapon. The reason this is my go-to, firstly because it was made from a decent metal and it's pretty sharp. Okay, you can't really see, but it's pretty sharp. Also, due to its heftiness and weight, it makes it a pretty ideal hack and slash weapon. Now, I will never take this if I ever were to engage in a weapon duel because it's not wieldy enough to maneuver against someone who's efficient at weaponry. But obviously in today's world, who is going to go for a weapon duel with live sharp weapon? Obviously no one, right? So therefore that's actually not an issue. Now when I say this is the go-to weapon that I take, is because when there's something wrong, this is the one I take out that I can potentially use against danger. And the reason I chose this one, as I said, because it's heavy and hefty, and when you're fighting against people who are not skilled swordsmen, you need something that is hefty and heavy duty to potentially cleave through things. And if you're sitting there wondering, what else is this guy talking about? You know, why would I ever want a sharp katana to cleave through stuff? Just Google South Africa, and you should be able to understand why I keep sharpened sword around and why I potentially would use these things in certain scenarios. I mean, this wouldn't compare to those top-end katanas, but for what I paid for it, it's a pretty decent cutting weapon. And obviously when I do take it out in case of emergency, I wouldn't feel bad even if I chip the blade. I mean, obviously in emergency you don't have the choice of thinking through before you cutting. Obviously if I would have an actual real expensive blade, I might actually feel really bad swinging hard against potential targets. Next, let's look at this blade, which I got from China. It's basically what we call a Meow Dog. And if you don't know what Meow Dog is, I actually have an entire video explaining the true origin of Meow Dog. But in a nutshell, it's a Chinese blade that is copied from the Japanese pirate. So this is actually fashioned in a Japanese way. So the blade is actually quite Japanese, except the decoration and the scabbard, the way you hand it, sort of eventually became more Chinese-like. You can see the blade itself, besides being relatively straight compared to the katana, is actually very similar to a Japanese blade. But of course, given the length, this will not be a katana, but a Odachi, which is a larger version of a dachi, which is a curved version of a katana. But yeah, all of those information are in my previous video on the history of Meow Dog, so I'm not going to go into detail here. So this weapon is sharp. While it looks kind of shiny and pretty well made and everything, the steel is not that great, so this one is not that excellent at cutting things. I used to basically use it for performance purposes because, you know, some of the Chinese events and organizers, they are kind of sensitive and touchy when you actually whip out a Japanese looking sword, and then whenever, you know, that happens, I tell them this is actually not a Japanese sword, it's actually fashioned in a Chinese way, including the decorations. And then they're more likely to accept that I'm actually swinging a sword like this in their performance. Other than performances, I don't ever use this sword. On the end here, you see a Wakisashi or a Odachi, right? Depending on the period, the design, and of course how you're carrying it. If you're carrying a short version of the Japanese sword with a katana, then it is a Wakisashi. If you're carrying it individually, then it's a Odachi. So this one is decently made. The steel is not that great, but it's pretty sharp, so it won't be able to cut through hard substance, but it's sufficient enough for self-defense purposes. And it's pretty light, obviously being a smaller dagger. And what's interesting is that the scabbard is metal. So what's great about this is, you know, if this is the only sword that you have, you can pretty much take it out and use the scabbard as a parrying dagger or something that you can deflect attack with and then use this one to attack. So it's almost like a 2-in-1 combo. If you know how to dual wield, of course. So even though this is pretty decent for practical purposes, but personally I actually use another Wakisashi that is shorter and with a thicker blade. This one is actually made from a better steel, that's why I prefer to use this one. Also very sharp, and it's pretty decently made, very maneuverable. Unfortunately, the scabbard is not made from metal, so you can't dual wield these. But the blade itself is sufficient enough for general purposes. And usually, if I'm in my house, I will probably the first choice to use this because the limited space, and obviously you don't want to swing a huge sword around and end up hitting stuff rather than hitting the intended target. That's why this one actually kept directly under my desk. And again, if you think that I'm being paranoid or strange, just look up what country South Africa is and you should be able to understand. So next, let's go upper scale. This one is a Odachi that I bought in Beijing. It's actually not a real blade, meaning that the metal is actually not good at all. It can't cut and it's not sharp and it's pretty soft. It's more like a replica, and a pretty bad replica at that. But the reason I bought it is because it was replicated very closely to an actual Japanese Odachi from the curve of the handle. As you notice that a lot of the other ones that I have, the handles are straight, which is actually not historically accurate. The actual Odachi have a curved handle, and the blade itself is also really curved. If you look from here, and you can see that the blade is actually more curved than usual compared to my other Chinese Meow Dog, which is actually straight. This is really curved. And the scabbard and everything, so pretty much it was a very detailed replica when it comes to appearance. It's just using very terrible steel, so this thing can't be used at all. Because I like the way it looks compared to every other Odachi I have in my collection, that's why I bought this. It's quite cheap. I sort of just keep it, for the look. Also, this one is pretty heavy due to the fact that whoever made this didn't really care about weight and usage and utility. So I used to basically use this one for strings and weight training because it's really hard to swing around. So if you can swing this, obviously you are getting stronger, and if you use a better weighted weapon, it will be easier. Next, let's look at the Chinese-made Odachi, and you can clearly see the problem, right? This handle is completely straight. It's not curved at all. I actually gave the specifics to the blacksmith that made this, but somehow he still couldn't understand that the handle is supposed to be slightly bent, like the one that I showed you just now. But at least the blade itself is decent. At least this one is made from a decent steel, so it does cut, not through other metal, but it will cut decent, regular stuff that you need to cut. And it is sharpened pretty decently. And this one is about 1.5 meter long. And this is the one that I actually used to practice with back in the days. And what's interesting is that, according to legend, now this isn't reality, this is legend, that the famous samurai that fought Musashi, known as Sasaki Kojiro, his long Odachi is basically 1.5 meters. So it's about the length of the sword, if that story is true, which I'm not 100% sure. And here is another Odachi that I specifically ordered from the swordsmith. And this one is quite special because it's actually 1.8 meter long, meaning this is as tall as myself. As you can see, it's really, really long. Other than the fact that it still has a straight handle, which is supposed to be slightly curved, something that they just can't understand. And the fact that the blade itself is not exactly as curved as the Odachi. Besides these issues, the blade itself is pretty decently made. As you can see, similar to the one I showed you previously. And it is sharp and made from a decent metal. So this one is more like an experiment. I kind of wanted to see the limitation of how long an Odachi can be before it's almost impossible to use. And yes, 1.8 meter turns out that it's actually very difficult even for my height to swing around and make use of. But it's still a pretty cool thing to keep around and just show people, even though this one isn't the one I'm going to go to when I need to use an Odachi. Another interesting thing is that on Odachi there is an inscription, right? Unlike my father, who is slightly narcissistic and therefore inscribed his own name on it, instead I inscribed a mantra. To be more precise, it is the mantra for Marasi, which is a Buddhist protector goddess, that's supposed to represent light and the sun. At the same time, in Japan, it's believed that she's also a goddess of battle and war, which is why it is a Japanese tradition to inscribe the blade with the inscription or the mantra of such goddess to represent battle and war and victory. Not that I believe inscribing this will do anything to the blade itself, it's just to be in accordance to the Japanese custom. Next, let's look at a Chinese double-handed longsword, also something I had to order specifically. This one is about 1.6 meter or 1.65, I can't remember exactly, and is fashioned in the Han Dynasty blade, meaning that it's a very small hilt or handguard. As you can see that, unlike the other which have a, Chinese handguard for Jian is always pretty bad, but this one is actually even smaller than the regular one. Such as if you look here, see this is a pretty bad handguard, but you can see that it is better than this one. So back in the early Han Dynasty, people weren't using these for dueling, so the need to protect the hand was not as big as later on. This is more just so that when you thrust something that your hand don't slip into the blade, right? It's actually mostly to stop your hand rather than to protect your hand when you are thrusting. And another thing to notice is you can see that the back of the sword has also a flat round disc. Again, this is for you to push against in order to thrust better into something. So you can see that sword back in those days, so from Spring-Warden Warring State all the way to Han Dynasty, these are mostly used for thrusting someone in battle and not for dueling. There were duelists, that people who fought with sword one-on-one, specifically for the entertainment of various kings and emperor, but on the whole, dueling was not a strong enough culture for the weapon to actually evolve toward protecting your hand and more suited for dueling. Instead, they're just suited for stabbing somebody on the battlefield. The sword itself is decently made. The steel is kind of decent, it's semi-sharp but not too much, so I can't really cut something really easily. But the blade is actually quite nice and really long, which is quite rare. I had to specifically order it. And you can see this one, the blade is just a regular diamond shape. The swordsman didn't bother to make that dent, which will probably reduce the weight and make it more maneuverable. And on this one, I have the inscription of Manjushri, which is a bodhisattva that represents wisdom. And in the Buddhist tradition, she carries a sword which represents her ability or wisdom that will cut through attachment and ignorance. Which is why it's fitting to have her mantra inscribed on a straight sword, which represents wisdom. So I still practice my 双手剑 form, right, the double-handed sword form I learned from the Yu Chenghui lineage. I used to practice that with this sword because it's long, so it actually looks really nice. But due to how heavy the sword is, it's not made to perform or to be wieldy. It's actually quite heavy. So this one you can see that it's actually a very stiff spine for a blade that's 1.6 meters long. Right, the longer they are, the easier it's supposed to flex. You can see that it's actually relatively stiff for a blade that long. It's not really flexing nearly as much as it should be, which makes this a pretty stiff spine relatively speaking. Great for actually thrusting through something, but not that good for maneuverability wise. So this one actually would be better for actually hacking and slashing rather than intricate type of motion. Of course, the blade is this long, you shouldn't be doing the intricate motions in any case if you want to go from a practical standpoint. And also back in the Warring State to the Han Dynasty, straight swords are predominantly used to hack and slash and thrust. What we see today as the Chinese classical Jian technique, the rapier-like fluent angle small motion, those came much later on. The original Jian were actually designed to hack and slash, and back then the single-edged broadsword, the Dao, does not even exist yet. It's only at a later point where they started making single-edged straight Jian, which at the time they called it Dao, because it's just easier to make one edge than two edge. Two edge takes twice the work, right? So at some point they start making these swords, straight swords, only one edge. And slowly from there, Dao evolved and they took over the job of hack and slash, and then Tien became a predominantly nimble and thrusting and poking type of weapon. But back in the days that this sword was based off, Tien is actually used for hack and slash. Right, here is a smaller version of 双手剑 or double-handed straight sword. You can see this one's much shorter than that one, probably about 1.3 meter only. That was like 1.6. So this one naturally is much more easier to maneuver and it's more flexible. It's actually still quite stiff, but definitely a lot lighter than that one. So I used to do performance with this because it's lighter, so that I don't have to be hindered by the weight and the movement looks smaller. But practice-wise, I use that one and not this one. In terms of craftsmanship, it's relatively simple. I mean, it's still kind of decent for performance blade, and the blade is actually not those wobbly fake blade. If I sharpen this, it probably can still cut, but it's not sharpened. And it's probably not made from good steel, so it's more for performance with a realistic weapon rather than a weapon that's made to cut and slash. Alright, so that covers all the weapons that's behind me. I hope you found this video interesting. And if you were wondering why I had so much weapon back in the days and practiced them, what happened now? I talked about this in my past video, but in short, at one point I realized the chance of me meeting a skilled weapon expert and having to work out the weapon and fight him is so little that it's basically not something that is worthwhile to invest a lot of time in. Instead, I should rather invest that time in perfecting my empty hand techniques and practice, because it's far more likely I'll engage in empty hand combat. And also, right, when I do work out these weapons on the street or on the road in my car, I carry them. I'm meeting people who are untrained in everything, so I don't need to be a weapon expert to use weapon efficiently in those scenarios. But when it comes to empty hand combat, then it's more likely that I will meet experts and decent fighters. I challenge people who go into duels. So therefore, it's just far more beneficial for me to invest my time in hand-to-hand combat training rather than weapon training. So that's why at some point I stopped doing these. I used to do a lot of weapon training when I focused on actually sparring and combat-oriented weapon techniques. I've done Chinese ones, I've done Kendo, and also want to do Kenjutsu. But eventually I realized that those are not worth investing, assuming my time is limited, which everyone's time is limited. So it's much better to invest my time in researching hand-to-hand stuff, especially internal mechanics, rather than spending them on learning how to fight with weapons, which I most likely will never actually use. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, consider subscribing on my YouTube channel. If you want to support me on Patreon, that would be greatly appreciated. As always, a shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for supporting me, especially through this pandemic. And when you do support me on Patreon, you will have access to a variety of videos, especially the in-depth analysis on the 4 fundamental forces, as well as how to apply the 4 forces to internal styles such as Yiquan. So any of you that are interested in understanding the internal mechanic using laws of physics rather than some vague metaphysical woo-woo nonsense, then you should definitely consider checking those videos out. They should definitely be of interest to you. Lastly, I would like to remind everyone that we're still in the pandemic, so keep your social distance, wear your mask, sanitize your hands, stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching TriEssence martial art channel, and I'll see you next time.